reasons. But what I do is I start with the first laboratory and look at the role of three kinds of shocks, what I call in the book triple shock. The first shock is a body blow to a country, something that rewrites the rules, scrambles a country, creates a state of exception. Now, in Latin America in the 70s, in Chile in particular, it was the military coups that used that language in particular. And they all said they were going to be temporary. None of them were supposed to last for more than a few months. But of course, some of them lasted for decades. So the first shock is a country shock, a shock to an entire country, to an entire society. And after that shock, in the state of confusion, in the state of fear, in the state of exception, you have the second shock, the economic shock therapy, this sort of tsunami of policy, of laws that are introduced all at once as a confusion method of their own to be shocking. Because if one reform is introduced at a time, people can organize and resist. But if it's presented as this ball of policies, dozens or even hundreds of laws at once, you can't resist. You're overwhelmed. That's the theory of economic shock therapy. So first you have the country shock, followed by the economic shock. And what we learned in Latin America so early on is that there was a third shock. And the third shock was the shock of repression, the shock of the police truncheon, the shock of the picanha, the non-metaphorical shock, the shocks to bodies. And what we know of torture, and I know you know this in Spain, but sadly it still is not understood in North America. Torture is never just about what goes on in an interrogation chamber between a prisoner and an interrogator. Torture is a form of mass communication. It is always semi-public. It has to be semi-public to work. Pinochet took this to extremes by doing it in football stadiums and turning it into spectatorship, showing the world just how brutal he was in those first days. But the point is that torture is still a form of mass communication. Guantanamo was built to be public. And the first images that we saw from Guantanamo of prisoners in orange jumpsuits on their knees with headphones and blackout goggles and American soldiers pointing guns at them were not leaked secretly. They were released by the Pentagon to the press as a form of mass communication. They called it Camp X-ray at the start, which is, I think it shows the public nature of it. It was a kind of a theater. It was a form of mass communication in the same way that the invasion of Iraq was a form of mass communication. This is what happens to you if you mess with the United States. Shock and awe was a form of communication. That's why Iraq was chosen. That's one of the reasons Iraq was chosen over Afghanistan, which was already too destroyed to provide the kind of mass communication and total domination that Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney wanted to communicate. You can't communicate total power if your enemy is too weak. They have to be somewhat strong, a little bit strong, or at least have the appearance of strength in order to project your absolute power. And on an individual level, Guantanamo played that same role of mass communication. So these three shocks, this intersection between the three shocks, and Eduardo Galeano at the time asked the question, and he asked it at the end of the 70s, how would it be possible to have these economic shocks without the electroshocks? Because, of course, Latin Americans knew at the time that there was a direct connection between the two.